test anxiety is a big thing. There was an OECD study. Singapore's test anxiety is like 76% of students versus, I think the global average was something like 50-60%. So obviously it's a problem here, but it's not really about whether having a lot of tests is an issue. I would argue that it's a mindset problem, right? It's a cultural, societal, parental expectation issue. I just don't like that general idea that, you get stressed with testing and so we test less. If you don't test enough, you're really burying your head in the sand, isn't it? So Naga, I have a confession. I actually really like to take exams. And before I tell you why, do you feel anxious when you take exams? Is exam anxiety a thing for you?
I think I am a bit more normal.
That's fair.
Okay. No matter how much I prepare before exam, I still feel as if something is missing and I'll feel anxious.
Right.
Yeah, so that's but I think that's pretty much majority of the population, I would say.
Right. I mean, I get nervous for sure. I think, my mom's watching this. She will say, you're always very stressed out before exam, as in me, right? Okay. But I think I say I like exams and tests in the sense that I think there's an excitement to it. I don't know, it's a bit psychotic, I get it. But you're preparing for it and then you do it and then you kind of see how things fare, right? And there's this excitement to, how did I do? Did I do well this time? And I have to say that it's not like I do well all the time. I failed like math tests, right? I've gotten like 15 out of 60 before.
Okay.
So it's not like it's always A's or B's or something.
I can see you're very excited about the test because I don't know how long ago was this test, but you remember the marks.
No, I remember the marks because that was like a low point for me in Sec 3. Right? Because like that was actually the turning point for me. After that, I was like, this is too embarrassing. I cannot be last 2 in class for math. Okay. So I'm going to start studying, But I actually feel that having those checkpoints like help, on some level. Like just having the cadence of, hey, I study, let's see how it does. It's like, I don't know, there's this excitement to it, right? Do you agree?
I don't know, choice of words. I wouldn't say it's excitement, but I would say something to put you in check, I suppose. Because I think what you mentioned just now, very more importantly, is that it keeps you in check. I mean, that's the main objective of tests, right? Whether you have learned it properly and correctly or not. You're testing, assessing yourself, I would say. So the question is, do we have to test all the time? Or sometimes when after learning, you would know that you have learned it well. Do we have to test to check whether we have learned it correctly or well? Is it necessary?
I think, I think my view is that ultimately, I like to learn. Okay, sounds again. I think I just
joy
started
of
this
learning.
Whole thing. No, but really, I think it's quite fun to learn stuff, right? And I think that's ultimately what we hope all kids do. But the reality is that everyone's kind of studying for a final exam. Like there is a predefined set of tasks that you have to complete, right? That you have to do, and I think tests are just a good build up to that, in the sense that, if you know your final exam, if we put it back to the school context, right? You're talking PSLE, O levels, A levels. You have this predefined exam. Yeah. You know what they're going to ask. You know how they're going to ask. Every test along the way, I like to call it a data point, right? I looked at it that way for myself when I was a student, both in school, like from primary to JC, as well as like, especially uni, I think. And it's a series of checkpoints, right? It's kind of like knowing whether you're on track or not. It's not about doing well all the time. But I think the data point is useful because you can course correct, right? I think this whole exam taking thing is a process. It's like you iterate until you get there. And so, with my students, with my own kid, I think that's my perspective, right? Which is, you don't have to do well at every test. I think when I talk about the excitement just now, it's like, it's exciting to just kind of know where you stand and kind of know what you have to do to go where you need to go. I think that's my perspective.
I think coming back to the point of the continuous tests, right? Like example, schools have already moved away, right? From mid-year exam, continual assessment, which is CA, all that, to actually, like they call it WA, weighted assessment in between, which are just there to check whether whatever has been taught prior to the test has been learnt well, so that they can move on to the next part of the year of learning. But I think what's more important is that sometimes people get stressed when there are too many, as you call it, data points. And I got stressed, right, when I was a student, because these data points accumulated to the final collation of marks. If you ask me, like at the end of the year, I think there's some percentage. I'm bad at maths. So basically, there's always like a 12.5% CA1 or something like that. And then 50% of mid-year exam. And then, it add up to the final score at the end of the year. So since they add up, so these tests, I was more concerned about the add up of the score rather than to check whether I was excited.
Yeah, you see, so the funny thing is, I mean, first of all, I will absolutely hate the current system.
Yeah.
Because there's not.
Thank God you're not a student now,
there's
right?
not enough testing. I mean, to be fair, what I would say is that I think I have a greater appreciation for the testing in JC and in uni. Maybe not so much in like as a primary school student. Obviously, I think that's hard to perceive. But I think one of the key things that you touched on is this idea of stress and how it adds up at the end. So my argument would be, it's not really about whether having a lot of tests is an issue. I would argue that it's a mindset problem, right? It's a cultural, societal, parental expectation issue, isn't it?
Correct. I mean, yeah, because I think data points not only for the student, for the student to see whether they have learned. Second, for the teacher to check whether they have thought well. I was a teacher in schools before, so I think that also will check whether my class has learned well. After I get the results, I also collate and I see whether my teaching was effective. Then also for the parents to know whether the kid has been learning well or is paying attention or not.
And I hear a lot of benefits there, right? So
correct.
It's good to test, isn't it?
But see, alongside these benefits come with the stress the student has to go through, which I think might look as if it outweighs at times, because nowadays students talk about stress a lot. I mean, even now, currently, our students, when they come for lessons and then they say, oh yeah, I've got a WA coming, I'm very stressed. Then I say, why? Oh, because I don't know what's going to be tested, or they will talk about whether I will do well. And then, because this is WA also adds up eventually. So I thought if the WA didn't add up and it's just a pop quiz, a surprise pop quiz, they call it in schools nowadays. If it's just that and it's just to check whether the kid understands, I think it would be better. I thought.
But if there's no stakes, right, then people don't care, right?
I mean, there will always be a group of people who don't care, right? But I think it's a mindset shift. If people can, students, I mean, if the schools can change the mindset of the students to make sure that these pop quiz or which doesn't collate to the end are done to check for the understanding of the student, whether they have learned or not, I think it'll be more effective. Because I think stress will always be there if there's a test, which will add up the score to the end. Because I think it's the same eventually. But I think why schools have moved away from the original system of the main thing about the whole test and all that, because I think the weightage was heavier and they test more things. So now I think it's, from what I can see, is less things, more acute testing on small portions of whatever has been learned. So I thought, I think that the thought process was to make it less stressful, easier to test smaller segments kind of approach.
I think my grouse here is that, again, I mean, you can link it back to me being a psycho and liking exams, but I think my grouse here is that if you don't test enough, you're really burying your head in the sand, isn't it? Like, you don't really know where you stand. One might argue that if you want to know, there are still avenues to know without school exams, right? Whether you get a third-party provider like tuition centers to do it, or you buy your own papers to do it. So I guess, we could argue that everyone wins on some level if you take away the testing, but I just don't like that general idea, right? That, you get stressed with testing and so we test less. I think maybe the smarter thing to do would be to talk about how we could shift mindsets and look at how every test is a data point. Like, don't be so, it's like, sure, it adds up to the grades. And if you are P3, 4, 5, you're like, yeah, your final report card might not look great. But the thing is, there's only one test that matters at the end, and that's the PSLE, right? So why are we hard up about that? Why are we hard up about every data point?
Yeah. We're not hard up about every data point. I think more importantly, what you mentioned just now, test less might not be the approach, or maybe that's not exactly what they're doing in schools, is test differently. Test differently so that
That's a good
it will
slogan.
not be...
That's a good slogan.
Test
You should
differently.
write in, you should write in the MOE,
Test differently, so there'll be no stress, that kind of thing, or less stress. So I thought test differently, maybe weaker students or students who are generally, not very keen in learning can be tested in a different way so that everybody gets tested. Okay, so you see, basic thing from what I gather from just now, all the things you said, you want to test so that you want to see the understanding. Okay, fair enough. And there's a lot of stakeholders, right? Like example, parents, there's teachers, there's students themselves. So everybody need to check whether or know whether the learning is done properly or correctly, because that's the main objective of the whole process. So what we need to do is that we want to check, but we don't want to stress the kids up. So these are the two things. Yeah. So test in a way that it's not done in a stressful way, or maybe you can still collate the score, but the consequence of the collation might not be that severe. Maybe the weightage is smaller. This kind of thing. I think schools are already doing it. Yeah. So I think, as you said, the solution is the big solution would be mindset shift.
Yeah. I mean, my philosophy, I have a kid in P1, right? And of course, no exams yet. Yeah. But let's talk about spelling. I think that's a good proxy for a test. And my attitude with him has always been, I need you to study for it. Correct. I want you to... you see, it's about the process. Like, I'm interested in the process. I'm not so interested in the outcome. So there were tests, there were spelling tests whereby, he got everything right at home. Correct. And then he didn't do as well in school. And I'm like, it's fine. I'm like, it happens, right? It's okay. You tried your best. You did it. You can do it, and just do it better next time. I think that's kind of the attitude that we just want to try to generally have. I mean, I get that not everyone will think like that. I get that sometimes, there could be test anxiety on both the side of the parents and the child, but that's what I mean by mindset shift, right? I feel like, maybe reducing the number of tests is not necessarily the solution. But I do recognize that test anxiety is a big thing. There was a OECD study, Singapore's test anxiety is 76% of students versus I think the global average was something like 50-60%. So obviously it's a problem here, but I would say it's an Asia thing. I don't necessarily think it's just a Singapore thing. I think it's an Asian mindset thing.
Yeah. I think we have moved on from the word stress to test anxiety, a bit more specific. I mean, nowadays, with mental health, this kind of things we're talking about. So, test anxiety is very specific to written tests, I think, where it's marked and then there is a score given at the end. Maybe I'm talking from a student's perspective. If I'm a student, I will have test anxiety when I get back the test and I have to show it to my parents because I'm worried about how my parent will react.
You just highlighted what the problem is. What
is it? The parent.
The problem is not the
not
test,
us.
right? Yeah, the problem is not really quite a test. So I think, I guess how I try to balance this is, as an educator, I'm a huge advocate of, I mean, put aside the psychoness of liking exams, right? But I think objectively as an educator, I like the idea of testing because I think it's data. I think it helps kids to course correct. Okay. I think that's important, right? If we want to say that learning and testing is a journey and a process, then course correction is a big part of that. So as an educator, I'm a huge believer in tests, right? I think it's so important to test. And the counterbalance for me as a parent is that I think how I message the importance of the test to my child is quite important, which is the preparation matters, but I don't want to be result-oriented. I want to be process-oriented. So I get that. I mean, in a way, this is kind of moot because they are reducing the testing anyway, right? But my point would be, even if there were more tests, I'll tell my son, I'll be like, you don't have to ace every test. That's really not the point. The point is get into the habit of learning, preparing, right? And then decide for yourself after that, are you happy with what you scored, right? And what are you going to do about it, right? I think that's the process, right? You don't want to be like A, why do you get 19 instead of 20 out of 20? That's nuts. That's arguably more nuts than what I said about liking exams, right?
That's exactly what we went through, right? As students, I don't know. I mean, for me, right, every mark counted. Right?
Your mom?
In a way, I mean, my parents would be like, okay, I have to give the reason why I had some questions wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Why I didn't fill in some blanks,
The passive-aggressive, subtle.
Yeah, so actually, that's why I say
thing,
the anxiety, the test anxiety, when you said it's actually not during the test, not doing the test, not preparing for the test, but when I come back with the test. Because I'll be like, okay, how? Because I'll be like, on the way back from school with the test paper in my bag, I'll be already formulating. This is the answers I'm going to say to my parents because I have to explain myself. And maybe also in a way that because I think after some time my parents gave me the responsibility to do my learning myself. So I had to answer for that. right? Accountability, right? So I gave you the responsibility to learn, and how come it turned out like that? So all the anxiety for me came from the part where I have to answer to my parents why I didn't get some things right, or what went wrong where, the kind of questions will be asked. So that's where my anxiety is. So because of that, then I will actually study harder for the test.
But
so
you see, again, I hear the good, right? You see, so that's a good takeaway, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good takeaway. I think I agree with you, but I think we should stop calling it that you're a psycho because of the you like tests, right? Some people really like being tested because they just like to be. It's also proving to yourself at times, I think, that you've done it well, you have learned it, it's good. Yeah. But I think overall, if parents can shift the mindset about tests and how they react to the outcome of every test their child does, I think everybody will benefit. And tests wouldn't be such a scary thing after all.
I think the notion of test different is a good one, because I think where I can walk back down from my stance is that I can accept that, maybe we don't test so much, but we test and assess differently. I think that excitement and that happiness that you get, that I get from doing tests sometimes is the, hey, I can do it kind of thing. And I think as a child, before you go to school, there's a lot more of that, I think the environment that a child grows up in from 1 to 6 is a lot more encouraging. It's like, hey, you can walk, hey, you said your first word. And then suddenly it became like, why is it 9 out of 10, Yeah. So maybe what we need to do is to test differently, right? Maybe give more progressive things for kids to do. And also, I think the mindset shift is huge. I think the good news is, I think we observe friends and family in our age group that have parents. I think our generation is better because we are the trauma generation.
Yes, of course.
We try not to traumatize our kids also.
Yeah, I explained my trauma just now.
I think, things are moving in the right direction. But, I think it's really about striking the balance between not hiding your head in the sand, like testing, and also, really being measured in how we interpret the test results.
Yeah, of course.